The relentless rhythm of the 20th Century Limited was a hypnotic lullaby of steel on steel, a sound of constant forward motion that offered little comfort to a soul in panicked retreat. For Sarah Jenkins, every mile the mighty locomotive devoured was a mile further from the ruin of her past, but she feared it was only taking her closer to a future just as bleak. She sat bolt upright on the plush green seat of the passenger car, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Beside her, nestled against the window, her 5-year-old son, Leo, slept soundly. His small face a perfect, peaceful portrait of an innocence she felt she had already lost forever. At 28, Sarah was a widow, though not by the hand of God or war. Her husband, a charming man with a gambler's heart, had taken his own life 2 months prior, leaving behind a mountain of debts and a string of broken promises. The creditors had descended like vultures, picking apart the remnants of their modest Chicago life until nothing was left but shame and eviction notices. Her husband's wealthy, unforgiving family had made it clear that there would be no help for her or her son. She was a stain on their respectable name. With her last few dollars, she had purchased 2 tickets on this train bound for New York City. It was an act of pure, desperate hope. She had a distant cousin there, a woman she hadn't seen in a decade, who had once said, "If you're ever in trouble, Sarah, find me." It was the thinnest of threads to hang a life upon, but it was all she had. She wore her best dress, a simple but respectable navy blue frock, now slightly rumpled from a day and a night of travel. She hadn't eaten since yesterday, giving the last of her sandwiches to Leo. Exhaustion was a heavy cloak on her shoulders, a deep, bone-weary fatigue that threatened to pull her under. Her eyes, red-rimmed from lack of sleep and unshed tears, began to droop. She fought against it, her sense of propriety warring with her body's desperate need for rest. It would not be proper to fall asleep in a public carriage, especially next to the imposing stranger who occupied the adjacent seat. The man had boarded in Cleveland. He was a figure of quiet, immense power, a fact evident in the fine, understated cut of his dark wool suit, the polished gleam of his leather shoes, and the respectful deference the train conductor had shown him. He was in his late 40s, with dark hair liberally streaked with silver at the temples, and a handsome, unsmiling face that seemed carved from granite. He had spent the entire journey staring out the window or reading financial reports from a leather briefcase, his expression intense and focused. He seemed to exist in a world entirely separate from the other passengers, a solitary island of wealth and power. His name was Julian Davenport, a name that would have meant nothing to Sarah, but was whispered with a mixture of awe and fear in the boardrooms of Wall Street. He was a titan of industry, a man who had built a manufacturing empire from the ground up through sheer force of will and a notoriously ruthless business acumen. He was a man who saw the world as a series of problems to be solved, of assets to be acquired, of inefficiencies to be eliminated. He had little time for the softer, messier aspects of human existence. As the train sped through the darkening landscape of upstate New York, Sarah's exhaustion finally won its battle. Her head, heavy with worry, began to nod. She fought to keep it upright, but the gentle, swaying motion of the train was an irresistible siren's call. Her eyelids fluttered and closed. Her body, seeking the nearest point of stability, slowly, unconsciously, began to list to the side. Julian Davenport felt a slight, unexpected weight against his shoulder. He turned his head, his initial reaction one of sharp irritation at the invasion of his personal space. He saw that the young woman beside him had fallen asleep, her head now resting fully against his shoulder. Her simple hat had slipped slightly, revealing a few stray curls of chestnut hair. He could hear her soft, even breathing, and the even softer breath of the small child sleeping beside her. His first instinct was to nudge her awake, to curtly reclaim his space. He looked at her face, pale and shadowed with a weariness that went beyond simple travel fatigue. He saw the faint dark circles under her eyes, the tense line of her brow that didn't fully relax even in sleep. He had noticed her when she boarded in Chicago, had noted the quiet desperation in her eyes and the fierce, protective way she held her son's hand. He had dismissed her as another piece of the anonymous human scenery, another life of quiet struggle that had no intersection with his own. But now, with her head resting on his shoulder, her presence was no longer anonymous. It was a tangible, vulnerable weight, an unexpected and not entirely unwelcome disruption to the rigid order of his world. He looked at her, then at the sleeping child, and something within his own guarded, lonely heart shifted. For reasons he could not comprehend, he did not wake her. He simply sat there, a statue of granite, and allowed her this small, unconscious act of trust. Hours passed. The train hurtled through the night. Julian did not move. He did not read his reports. He simply sat, staring out at the fleeting lights of sleeping towns, acutely aware of the warm, living presence beside him. It was the closest he had been to another human being in years. As the first grey light of dawn began to break over the horizon, the train's whistle blew a long, mournful cry, signaling their approach to New York City. The change in the train's rhythm finally stirred Sarah from her deep, exhausted sleep. She awoke slowly, her mind foggy. Her first sensation was one of unexpected comfort. Her cheek was resting against something warm and solid, something that felt safe. She shifted slightly, her eyes fluttering open. She was met with the sight of a fine, dark blue wool suit jacket. Her mind slowly registered that it was not a pillow. It was a shoulder, a man's shoulder. Horror, sharp and absolute, shot through her. She jerked upright, her face flooding with a hot, mortified blush. "Oh my goodness," she gasped, her voice a horrified whisper. "I am so sorry, sir. I don't know what happened. I fell asleep. I am terribly sorry to have disturbed you." She expected him to be angry, disgusted. She expected a cold glare, a dismissive remark. Instead, Julian Davenport simply turned his head to look at her, his face as unreadable as ever. His grey eyes held no anger, no irritation. They held only a quiet, unnerving neutrality. He didn't say a word. He simply raised his hand, and before she could react, his thumb gently brushed a stray tear track from her cheek. He then stood up, retrieved his briefcase from the overhead rack, and walked away down the aisle without a backward glance, leaving Sarah sitting there, her heart pounding, her mind reeling in a state of utter, profound shock at what he had just done. The train slid into the cavernous, echoing expanse of Grand Central Terminal with a final, prolonged hiss of its air brakes. The chaotic energy of New York City immediately flooded the passenger car. People grabbed their luggage, their voices a loud, impatient chorus as they pushed their way into the aisles. For Sarah, the arrival was not an exciting beginning, but a terrifying finality. She was here, and she was utterly, completely alone. She gently woke Leo, whose sleepy, bewildered face mirrored her own inner turmoil. "We're here, my love," she whispered, forcing a smile that felt brittle and foreign on her lips. Wrangling their single heavy suitcase and a sleepy 5-year-old through the throng of passengers was a Herculean task. By the time they reached the main concourse, Sarah was breathless, her arms aching. She stood for a moment under the magnificent star-painted ceiling, feeling like a tiny, insignificant insect. The sheer scale of the station, the ceaseless river of humanity flowing in every direction, was overwhelming. This city did not just move, it devoured. Her first priority was to contact her cousin. She found a row of public telephone booths, the last of her coins clutched in her hand. Leaving Leo sitting on their suitcase with strict instructions not to move, she entered a booth and gave the operator the number she had scribbled on a piece of paper, a number she had not dialed in over a decade. The line connected. A woman's voice, a stranger's voice, answered. "Hello?" "Hello," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm trying to reach Mrs. Eleanor Gable. Does she live here?" There was a pause on the other end. "Eleanor Gable," the woman said. "Oh no, dear. The Gables moved out west years ago. California, I think. We've had this number for at least 5 years." The word struck Sarah with the force of a physical blow. Moved away, years ago. The thin thread of hope she had been clinging to snapped, leaving her in a free-fall of absolute panic. Is there a forwarding address?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "No, dear, nothing, I'm sorry," the woman said, not unkindly, before the line went dead. Sarah hung up the receiver, her hand shaking. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass of the booth, the roar of the station fading to a dull hum in her ears. She was truly stranded. A widow with a 5-year-old child, less than $2 in her purse, and nowhere to go in the biggest, most indifferent city in the world. A wave of hot, helpless tears she had fought so hard to contain finally spilled over. She stepped out of the booth to see Julian Davenport standing not 20 feet away. He was flanked by 2 men in sharp suits, clearly his assistants, who were listening to his low, decisive instructions. He was a man in his element, a king commanding his court. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second across the bustling concourse. She saw a flicker of recognition in his gaze before he turned away, dismissing her as he had on the train. Of course he would. Why would a man like that give a second thought to the rumpled, crying woman from the passenger car? Humiliated, she quickly wiped her tears and returned to her son. "Come, Leo," she said, her voice strained. Let's find a place to sit for a moment." She had no plan. Her mind was a blank wall of panic. She could find a shelter, perhaps. But what then? How would she find work? How could she possibly care for her son in this monstrous city? As she was trying to pull her heavy suitcase, its wheel catching on a crack in the floor, a long shadow fell over her. "It seems you're having some difficulty, Mrs. Jenkins." She looked up. It was him. Julian Davenport stood before her, his assistants having vanished. His face was as impassive as ever, but his grey eyes were fixed on her with an unnerving, analytical intensity. I am fine, sir," she stammered, flustered. "Your expression suggests otherwise," he stated coolly. "I happened to be nearby when you were on the telephone. I surmise your travel plans have not unfolded as you had hoped." His directness was both shocking and, in a strange way, a relief. There was no room for pretense. "No, sir," she admitted, her voice small. "They have not." He was silent for a moment, his gaze shifting from her face to her son, who was now looking up at this imposing stranger with wide, curious eyes. "I find myself in a difficult situation as well," he said, the change of subject so abrupt it startled her. "You, sir?" "Yes," he said. "I have a 7-year-old daughter. Her governess, an otherwise capable woman, resigned this morning without notice to get married. An irresponsible and deeply inefficient act. My daughter requires constant supervision, and I am scheduled to leave for London on business in 3 days. I require a replacement. Immediately." He looked at her, his eyes narrowed in thought. "You are," I observed on the train, "a mother. You appear to be responsible, and despite your current predicament, you carry yourself with a certain dignity. You are also, I deduce, in immediate need of both lodging and employment." Sarah stared at him, her mind unable to process the direction this was heading. "I'm prepared to offer you the position of governess to my daughter, effective immediately," he said, his voice as calm and as pragmatic as if he were discussing a stock purchase. "The position includes a private suite of rooms in my Fifth Avenue townhouse, all meals, and a salary that I assure you is more than generous. Your son would be welcome. My daughter would likely benefit from the companionship. It is a temporary arrangement until I can find a permanent replacement upon my return from Europe. A 6-week contract." The offer was so sudden, so absurd, so utterly out of the blue that Clara could only stare at him. Was this a joke? A cruel game? "Why?" she finally managed to whisper. "Why me? You don't know me." "Your assessment is correct. I do not," he said, without a flicker of emotion. "However, what I do know is that I have an urgent staffing crisis that needs to be solved within the next 72 hours. You have an urgent domestic and financial crisis that needs to be solved immediately. This is not an act of charity, Mrs. Jenkins. It is a mutually beneficial solution to 2 corresponding problems. My problem is time. Yours is a lack of resources. I am offering to exchange one for the other." His logic was as cold and as hard as diamond, and yet it was a lifeline. A strange, unbelievable lifeline. I don't know what to say," she stammered. He reached into his pocket and produced a slim, elegant business card. "My car is waiting outside. My offer stands for 1 hour. You will find that I do not make such offers twice." He pressed the card into her hand. "I suggest you consider it carefully." He gave her a final curt nod, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd as quickly as he had appeared, leaving Sarah standing there with his heavy, expensive card in her hand. She looked at the card. It simply read, Julian Davenport, Davenport Industries, New York, London, Paris. She looked at her son, his small hand now clutching hers tightly, and she looked at the chaotic, indifferent city that stretched out before her. She was out of money, out of options, out of time. This man was offering her a sanctuary. It might be a cold, strange, and temporary one, but it was a sanctuary nonetheless. A roof over their heads, food for her son, a purpose. Her choice was no choice at all. It was the only choice. Taking a deep breath, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and a wild, fragile hope, Sarah picked up her suitcase, took Leo's hand, and walked towards the grand entrance of the station, towards the waiting car of the powerful, enigmatic man who had just made her the most unbelievable proposition of her life. The drive to Julian Davenport's townhouse was a short, silent journey that felt like crossing into another dimension. The car turned off the bustling artery of Fifth Avenue and onto a quiet, tree-lined side street, pulling to a stop before a magnificent limestone building. It was not a sprawling Gothic manor like the ones that dotted the Hudson Valley, but a masterpiece of modern Art Deco design. Its lines were clean and sharp, its windows large and geometric, its brass doors polished to a brilliant, intimidating sheen. It was less a home and more a monument to wealth, power, and cold, uncompromising precision. A uniformed doorman opened the car door, and Julian stepped out, turning to offer a formal, impersonal hand to help Sarah alight. She took it, her own small, work-roughened hand feeling lost in his. She gathered a sleepy Leo into her arms and followed him up the steps. The interior was even more breathtaking and intimidating than the exterior. The foyer was a cavern of black and white marble, with a soaring ceiling and a magnificent cascading crystal chandelier that looked like a frozen waterfall. The air was cool and still, smelling faintly of lemon polish and money. There was no clutter, no sign of life, no hint of the messy, comfortable chaos of a real home. It was beautiful, perfect, and utterly soulless. A stern-looking woman in a crisp black dress and a severe bun, clearly the head housekeeper, greeted them with a stiff, formal bow. "Mr. Davenport, sir. Welcome home." "Mrs. Albright," Julian said, his tone all business. "This is Mrs. Sarah Jenkins and her son Leo. Mrs. Jenkins will be assuming the role of governess for Amelia, effective immediately. Please show her to the governess's suite and see to it that she and the boy are made comfortable." "Very good, sir," the housekeeper said, her eyes giving Sarah a quick, dismissive once-over. "Where is Amelia?" Julian asked. "In the library, sir. It is her scheduled reading hour." "Of course," Julian murmured. He then turned to Sarah. "Come, Mrs. Jenkins, you should meet your charge." He led them to a library that was the polar opposite of the warm, cluttered sanctuaries Sarah loved. This room was a testament to order. The books were arranged not by subject, but by the color of their spines, creating a visually perfect but intellectually chaotic display. In a large armchair, positioned precisely in the center of the room, sat a small, solitary figure. Amelia Davenport was a tiny 7-year-old girl with her father's dark hair and serious gray eyes. She was dressed in a pristine white dress, her hair in 2 neat, tight braids. She was not reading the book in her lap, but simply staring out the window, her expression one of quiet, profound loneliness. "Amelia," Julian said, his voice softer than Sarah had yet heard it. "This is Mrs. Jenkins. She will be looking after you for a while. And this is her son, Leo." Amelia turned her large, solemn eyes on them. She looked at Sarah, then at Leo, her expression unreadable. She gave a small, polite, and utterly joyless curtsy. "How do you do, Mrs. Jenkins?" she said, her voice a tiny, formal whisper. Leo, who had been hiding behind Sarah's skirts, chose that moment to peek out. "Hello?" he said, his own voice a cheerful, boisterous sound that seemed to shatter the room's fragile silence. "Do you have any toy soldiers?" Amelia simply stared at him, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. It was clear she was a child unaccustomed to the cheerful, messy intrusion of other children. "That will be all for now," Julian said, sensing the awkwardness. He addressed Sarah. "As I mentioned, I depart for London in 2 days. Your duties are simple. You will adhere to Amelia's schedule, which Mrs. Albright will provide for you. It is precise. You will oversee her meals, her studies with her tutors, and her recreation. You are responsible for her well-being in my absence." "I understand, sir," Sarah said. "Good," he said with a curt nod. "Mrs. Albright will show you to your quarters." The governess's suite was, to Sarah's astonishment, larger and more luxurious than any home she had ever lived in. It consisted of a comfortable sitting room, a small bedroom for herself, and an adjoining room for Leo. It was all decorated in the same cool, impersonal style as the rest of the house, but it was a safe, warm, and private space. It was a haven. The next 2 days passed in a blur of orientation. Mrs. Albright, the housekeeper, presented her with Amelia's schedule. It was a document as detailed and as rigid as a military campaign plan. 7:02 a.m. Wake up. 7:30. Breakfast. 8:00 to 11:00. Lessons with tutors. 11:00 to 12:00. Piano practice. 12:00. Lunch. Every hour of the young girl's life was accounted for, with little room for spontaneity or joy. Sarah's heart ached for the lonely little girl. She did her best to follow the rules, but she also began to inject small, quiet acts of rebellion. She would suggest a game of hide-and-seek during the recreation hour, instead of a formal walk in the park. During story time, she would use funny voices for the characters, an act that earned her a small, surprised smile from Amelia. And she allowed Leo, with his boundless, cheerful energy, to be himself. He would build forts out of pillows and run his toy cars along the expensive Persian rugs, his happy shouts a foreign sound in the silent townhouse. Julian observed all of this from a distance. He would see Sarah on the floor with the 2 children, helping them build a castle of blocks, her face animated and full of a maternal warmth that filled his house like a foreign perfume. He saw his own daughter, who was usually so quiet and solemn, laugh out loud at one of Leo's antics. He saw the life, the color, the simple, messy joy that this woman had brought into his sterile, ordered world in the space of 48 hours. It was unsettling. It was inefficient, and it was, he was forced to admit to himself, beautiful. On the morning of his departure, he came to the nursery to say goodbye to his daughter. He found Sarah sitting on the floor, showing Amelia and Leo how to make shadow puppets on the wall with their hands. He stood in the doorway for a moment watching. Amelia, seeing him, immediately stood up and smoothed down her dress, her formal, solemn mask slipping back into place. "Father," she said, with a small curtsy. "Amelia," he said, giving her a brief, awkward hug. "Be good for Mrs. Jenkins." He then turned to Sarah. "My ship sails in 2 hours. Mrs. Albright has my itinerary. You are to contact my office in case of any emergency." "Of course, Mr. Davenport," she said, rising to her feet. "Have a safe journey." He looked at her, then at the 2 children. For a fleeting second, a look of profound, unreadable emotion crossed his face, a mixture of regret, of longing, of a man seeing a life he did not know how to live. "See that they have fun," he said, the words sounding strange on his tongue. And then he turned and was gone. That evening, after tucking both a tired Leo and a surprisingly reluctant Amelia into bed, Sarah stood at the large window of her sitting room, looking out at the glittering, indifferent lights of New York City. She was the temporary governess in a billionaire's palace, the caretaker of a lonely little girl, and the employee of a powerful, enigmatic man who was a complete mystery to her. Her life was no longer her own. It was a 6-week contract. But as she thought of Amelia's small, hesitant smile that afternoon, she felt a new and unfamiliar sense of purpose take root in her heart. She was not just here for a job. She was here, she realized, to bring a little bit of warmth and chaos into this beautiful, cold, and desperately sad house. The 6 weeks of Julian Davenport's absence stretched before Sarah like a vast, unknown territory. Her official role was that of a temporary governess, a placeholder in the rigid, structured world of his home. But Sarah, with her innate maternal warmth and practical wisdom, could not simply be a caretaker. She had to be a nurturer. The first week was a quiet battle of wills between her and the formidable housekeeper, Mrs. Albright. The housekeeper was a woman who worshipped at the altar of order and silence, and she viewed Sarah's and particularly Leo's presence as a chaotic disruption. "Mr. Davenport prefers a quiet household, Mrs. Jenkins," she would say, her lips a thin, disapproving line whenever Leo's cheerful laughter echoed in the grand hallways. "Mr. Davenport also said he wanted his daughter to have fun," Sarah would reply with a calm, unshakable smile, refusing to be intimidated. Slowly, gently, Sarah began to thaw the icy perfection of the townhouse. She discovered that the formal dining room, which was only to be used for dinner according to the schedule, had the best morning light. So she began serving the children's breakfast there, a small act of rebellion that filled the somber room with the scent of oatmeal and the cheerful chatter of a 5-year-old boy. She found a small, neglected rooftop garden, and she and the children spent their afternoons there, planting winter herbs in small pots. Her most important project, however, was Amelia. The little girl was a miniature version of her father, quiet, serious, and surrounded by walls of her own making. She followed her schedule with a dutiful precision, but seemed to derive no joy from it. She treated Leo with a detached, clinical curiosity, as if he were a strange new species of insect. Sarah knew that Amelia's reserve was not coldness, but a deep, ingrained loneliness. She began her campaign with stories. Every night before bed she would read to both children, her voice full of warmth and animation, creating different voices for every character. Leo would giggle and squirm with delight. Amelia at first would listen with a solemn stillness, but after a few nights, Sarah noticed the corner of her mouth twitching in a suppressed smile. The breakthrough came during a thunderstorm. The sky over Manhattan cracked open, the sound of thunder rattling the large windows of the townhouse. Sarah was in her sitting room when she heard a small, terrified cry from Amelia's bedroom. She rushed in to find the little girl sitting bolt upright in her bed, her small body trembling, her face pale in the flashes of lightning. Sarah didn't say a word. She simply sat on the edge of the bed and gathered the trembling child into her arms. Amelia stiffened at first, unused to such spontaneous affection, but then with a small sob, she melted against Sarah, burying her face in the soft fabric of her dress. "It's all right, my sweet," Sarah murmured, stroking her hair. "It's just the sky making a bit of noise. It will pass." She held her until the trembling subsided, telling her a quiet, rambling story about a brave little firefly who wasn't afraid of thunderstorms. Leo, woken by the noise, padded in and crawled onto the bed as well, adding his own small comforting presence. And there, in the middle of the stormy night, the three of them became a small, unlikely family. As she had been instructed, Sarah wrote weekly reports to Julian in London. Her first report was formal and professional, detailing Amelia's adherence to her schedule. "Dear Mr. Davenport," she wrote, "Amelia's progress continues to be satisfactory. All lessons and appointments have been attended to as per your instructions." But as the weeks went on, her letters began to change. They became less about schedules and more about the small, beautiful moments of their days. "Dear Julian," she wrote in the third week, the use of his first name feeling both bold and strangely natural. "Amelia laughed out loud today. Properly laughed. Leo was trying to teach her how to make a paper boat, and it kept sinking in the bathtub. I wish you could have heard it. The sound was like music in this quiet house." In London, in a sterile suite at the Savoy Hotel, Julian Davenport found himself living for these letters. They were a window into a life he didn't recognize in a house that was supposedly his. He would read them after long, grueling days of negotiations, and the warmth of her words would seep into his weary soul. He read about their picnics in the rooftop garden, about the finger-painting masterpiece Amelia and Leo had created on the kitchen floor, about the shadow puppets they made in the nursery. He began to write back, his own replies growing less formal. He told her about the fog in London, about a terribly boring business dinner he had endured, about a beautiful painting he had seen at the National Gallery that had reminded him of her. Their letters crossed the Atlantic, weaving a fragile, intimate thread between two lonely people. The true impact of her presence hit him one rainy London evening. He had just concluded a particularly ruthless negotiation, a victory that felt hollow and tasteless. He returned to his silent hotel room and found her latest letter waiting for him. "My dearest Julian," it began, "we had a grand adventure today. We decided to have an indoor camp-out. We built a magnificent fort out of all the parlor cushions and told ghost stories by flashlight. Mrs. Albright was quite horrified, but Amelia declared it the best day of her life. She is a different child, Julian. She is happy. I only wish you were here to see her smile." He sat there holding the letter and was struck by a feeling so powerful it almost knocked the wind out of him. It was a feeling of profound, aching longing. He did not long for his business, or his city, or his wealth. He longed for the sound of his daughter's laughter. He longed for the warmth of the home he had never truly lived in, and he longed, with a desperation that stunned him, for the woman who had created all of it. He realized he wasn't just grateful to her, he was falling in love with her. The 6 weeks finally came to an end. On a crisp, bright morning, Sarah stood in the foyer, a nervous flutter in her stomach. The townhouse was filled with the happy sounds of Leo and Amelia playing a game of chase in the parlor. Julian was coming home. She heard the sound of a key in the front door. Her heart leaped into her throat. The great brass door swung open and Julian Davenport stepped inside. He stopped on the threshold, his briefcase in hand, and simply stared. He saw the vase of bright autumn flowers on the hall table. He heard the sound of his daughter's genuine, joyous laughter echoing from the parlor. He saw Sarah, standing there waiting for him, her face alight with a warm, welcoming smile. He was not looking at a house, he was looking at a home. And as his eyes met hers, he knew that his journey to London had been nothing compared to the journey he had just taken, right here, in his own heart. The reunion in the foyer was a moment suspended in time. Julian stood on the threshold, a man returned not just from a different continent, but from a different life. He looked at the scene before him, the happy, chaotic sounds of his daughter and Leo playing, the vase of bright autumn flowers on the hall table, the warm, welcoming smile on Sarah's face, and felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he had walked into the wrong house. But a deeper, truer part of him knew with an unshakable certainty that he had finally, truly come home. Amelia, seeing him, broke off her game of chase and ran towards him, her usual solemnity replaced by a bright, unrestrained joy. "Father, you're home!" she exclaimed, launching herself into his arms. Julian, startled by this unprecedented show of affection, knelt and caught her, hugging her tightly. He had never been greeted this way before. His homecomings had always been quiet, formal affairs, met with a polite curtsy from his daughter and a respectful nod from the staff. This was different, this was joy. "I missed you, Amelia," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "We had an indoor camp-out," she said, her words tumbling out in an excited rush. "And we made shadow puppets. Mrs. Jenkins knows how to make a rabbit and a wolf." He looked over his daughter's head at Sarah, who was watching them with a gentle, knowing smile. His heart felt a strange, unfamiliar pang, a mixture of overwhelming gratitude and a deep, aching tenderness. She had not just cared for his daughter, she had given her a childhood. The weeks following his return were a period of delicate readjustment. The 6-week contract had expired, but the subject of Sarah's departure was a silent, unspoken dread that hung in the air. Julian could not bear the thought of the house returning to its former cold silence, of Amelia retreating back into her solemn shell. But he was a man of contracts and logic, and he did not know how to navigate this new, messy territory of the heart. He tried to maintain a professional distance, but it was impossible. Their lives were now deeply intertwined. He found himself looking forward to dinner each evening, not just for the delicious food, but for Sarah's quiet, intelligent conversation. He would tell her about his day, the complex pressures of his business, and she would listen with an empathy and insight that he found more valuable than the advice of his entire board of directors. He saw the way she managed his home, not just as a housekeeper, but as a true partner. She knew his habits, anticipated his needs, and created a sanctuary of peace and order for him to retreat to from the harsh world of business. More than that, he saw the incredible bond she had forged with Amelia. She was the mother his daughter had never had, providing a warmth and steady affection that was transforming the quiet, lonely little girl into a happy, confident child. Sarah, for her part, was living on borrowed time, and she knew it. She had fallen deeply in love with this quiet, surprisingly gentle man and the strange, wonderful little family they had created. But she was still, officially, the governess, an employee. She knew the arrangement could not last forever, and the thought of leaving, of taking Leo and returning to a world of uncertainty, was a constant, low-grade ache in her heart. The inevitable conversation happened one evening a week after his return. The children were in bed and they were sitting in the library, a comfortable silence between them as he reviewed a business proposal, and she mended a tear in one of Leo's shirts. "The contract," he began, his voice suddenly formal, making her look up. "Our original agreement has concluded." Sarah's heart sank. This was it. He was letting her go. She steeled herself, her hands stilling in her lap. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I know, I have been looking at advertisements for other positions. We will be out of your way as soon as possible." A look of alarm crossed Julian's face. "Leaving? That was not my intention at all, Mrs. Jenkins." He put his papers down, giving her his full attention. "On the contrary, I have come to realize that your position here is indispensable." He stood up and began to pace before the fire, a sign of his inner turmoil. "When I left for London, I left you in charge of my child and my house, a simple temporary arrangement, but what I returned to was something else entirely. You have not just managed this house, you have transformed it. You have not just cared for my daughter, you have made her happy." He stopped and faced her, his expression serious. "My offer of temporary employment is no longer sufficient. I would like to offer you a permanent position." Hope, fragile and tentative, fluttered in her chest. "A permanent position?" "Yes," he said. "As official chatelaine of this household, you would have full authority over the staff, the budgets, the running of this entire estate. It would be a position of great responsibility with a salary to match. Amelia and I, we need you, Sarah." He was offering her everything she could have dreamed of: security, a home, a respectable and powerful position. It was a lifeline beyond compare. Yet her heart ached. A permanent position. Chatelaine. It was still a job. She would be a permanent fixture in his life, but as a superior employee, not as an equal. She would have to watch him from the sidelines, to love him in silence while he eventually found a suitable wife from his own social class. The thought was unbearable. He must have seen the conflict in her eyes. "Is the offer not to your liking?" he asked, a hint of confusion in his voice. "The offer is more than generous, Julian," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "But a position, no matter how grand, is still a position. And a house, no matter how beautiful, is not a home if your heart is not at peace within it." The raw honesty of her words hung in the air between them. He finally understood. She was not asking for more money or a grander title. She was speaking of the heart. He walked to her chair and knelt before her, just as he had in their other lives, his own heart pounding with a terrifying, exhilarating realization. He had been hiding behind logic, behind contracts and positions, because he was afraid of the truth of what he truly felt. He had been so focused on the problem of keeping her in his house, he had failed to address the desire of keeping her in his life. "You are right," he said, his voice a husky whisper. He took her hand. "Forgive me. I am a fool. I am a man who understands balance sheets and legal contracts, but I am an utter novice in the matters of the heart." He looked up at her, his grey eyes stripped bare of all pretense, showing her the full, unguarded depth of his soul. "I am not offering you a job, Sarah. I am asking you to share my life, not as my housekeeper, but as my wife. The position of chatelaine is already yours, but the position of Mrs. Julian Davenport is the one I am begging you to accept. Marry me, Sarah. Stay and build a real home, a real family with me." It was the question her heart had been longing for, the words she had never dared to hope she would hear. He was not offering her a permanent job. He was offering her a permanent love. Tears streamed down her face now, but they were tears of overwhelming, profound joy. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Julian, I will marry you." The library, which had witnessed so many of their quiet, transformative moments, now bore witness to their greatest joy. Julian slid the beautiful sapphire ring from his pocket, a ring he had purchased weeks ago on a hopeful whim, and placed it on Sarah's finger. It was a perfect fit. The profound sense of rightness, of coming home, washed over both of them. The years of loneliness, the separate griefs they had carried, had led them here to this moment, to each other. Their first act as an engaged couple was to tell the children. The next morning they gathered Amelia and Leo in the sunny parlor. The children had become inseparable, their bond a testament to the family they had already formed in their hearts. "Amelia, Leo," Julian began, his voice full of a gentle gravity. He sat on the floor with them, an act that would have been unthinkable just months ago. Sarah sat beside him, her hand resting on his knee. "Mrs. Jenkins and I have something important to tell you. We have decided to get married." Leo, at 5, simply grinned. "Does that mean Sarah gets to stay forever?" he asked, his priorities clear. "Yes, son," Sarah said, her heart swelling. "It does." Amelia, however, was quiet. She looked from her father's happy, hopeful face to Sarah's warm, loving one. A slow, wondrous smile spread across her own face. "Does this mean I can call you Mama?" she asked Sarah, her voice a small, hesitant whisper. The question, so simple and yet so profound, brought tears to Sarah's eyes. She pulled the little girl into a fierce hug. "Oh, my sweet girl," she whispered, "nothing would make me happier." In that moment, they were a family, complete and whole. It felt as if their happiness was a fortress, impenetrable and secure. But they had not yet accounted for the formidable forces of the outside world, particularly in the form of Julian's older sister, Penelope Davenport Astor. Penelope was a titan of New York high society, a woman whose invitations were coveted and whose disapproval could be socially fatal. She had, for years, taken it upon herself to manage her reclusive brother's social life from afar, constantly trying to arrange matches with women from suitable blue-blooded families. The news of Julian's engagement to his daughter's governess, a penniless widow no less, did not arrive via a polite announcement. It arrived like a thunderclap through the city's ruthlessly efficient gossip mill. 2 days after their private engagement, the gleaming brass doors of the townhouse burst open and Penelope swept in like a hurricane in couture. She was a tall, impeccably dressed woman with sharp features and Julian's same stormy grey eyes, though hers held none of his warmth. "Julian," she exclaimed, her voice echoing in the marble foyer. "What is the meaning of this absurdity? The entire city is laughing at us." She found them in the library, reading with the children. She stopped dead, her eyes landing on Sarah, who sat on the floor with Leo and Amelia, her expression one of serene, domestic bliss. Penelope's gaze swept over Sarah's simple dress, her plain, unadorned hair, and her full, motherly figure. A look of pure, unadulterated horror crossed her face. "You," Penelope said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You must be the governess." "Penelope, that is enough," Julian said, rising to his feet, his voice cold as ice. He positioned himself slightly in front of Sarah and the children, a protective barrier. "This is Sarah Jenkins, my fiancée." "Fiancée?" Penelope let out a short, sharp laugh. "Don't be ridiculous. This is a temporary infatuation, a symptom of your grief and isolation. I am here to put a stop to it before you completely destroy the Davenport name." She dismissed Sarah with a wave of her hand as if she were a servant. "Mrs. Jenkins, be a dear and have the children taken to the nursery. My brother and I have family matters to discuss." But Sarah did not move. She looked at Julian, and in his eyes, she saw not shame or doubt, but a quiet, unwavering strength that gave her courage. "The children are fine where they are, Penelope," Julian said, his voice flat. "And Sarah is not going anywhere. She is family. Now what is it you want?" Furious at being challenged, Penelope launched into her attack. "What do I want? I want to save you from this catastrophic mistake. A governess, Julian, a no-name widow from Chicago. Have you lost your mind? She's a fortune hunter, a cunning schemer who has taken advantage of your loneliness. She will make you a laughingstock." "The only person making a laughingstock of themselves here is you, Penelope," Julian replied, his voice dangerously calm. "Sarah Jenkins is a woman of more character, intelligence and grace than anyone I have ever met in the shallow, gossiping world you inhabit. She has brought more happiness into this house in 2 months than you have in your entire life. Her past is one of struggle and dignity. Yours is one of privilege and judgment. I know which I prefer." Penelope was taken aback by the force of his defense, her face pale with rage. "You would choose her over your own family, over your own standing in the world?" "She is my family now," he said, his voice ringing with finality. "And as for my standing, if it requires me to surround myself with people as cruel and as prejudiced as you, then I want no part of it." Defeated in her direct assault, Penelope changed her tactics. She gave Sarah a look of pure venom. "You may have fooled him, you clever little mouse," she hissed, "but you will not fool New York. I will make it my personal mission to see that you are never accepted. Every door will be closed to you. Every invitation will be lost. You will be a pariah. Let's see how long your little romance lasts when you are the most hated woman in the city." She turned on her heel and stormed out of the house, leaving a trail of poisonous silence in her wake. The battle lines had been drawn. The final challenge was not a business rival or a past villain, but the full, crushing weight of high society, with Julian's own sister leading the charge. Sarah looked at Julian, her heart aching for the rift she had inadvertently caused. "I am so sorry, Julian," she whispered. He came to her and knelt before her and the children, pulling them all into a group hug. "Do not be sorry," he said, his voice fierce with love. "She is the one who should be sorry. We do not need their world, Sarah. We will build our own." He looked from her face to the faces of the 2 children, who now looked to them as parents. He saw his future, right here in this room. The world outside could gossip and rage all it wanted. In here, in the heart of their new, unconventional family, they had everything they would ever need. Their fortress was not made of stone or built on a name, but on the simple, unshakable foundation of their love. The aftermath of Penelope's visit left a tangible chill in the air, a promise of the social winter to come. Just as she had threatened, the world Julian had once commanded began to turn its back on them. Invitations to dinners and social functions, which had begun to trickle in again after his re-emergence, ceased entirely. Those that did arrive were addressed with a pointed cruelty to Mr. Julian Davenport alone. Julian would burn them without comment, his jaw set in a hard line. His instinct was to retreat, to pull Sarah and the children deeper into the sanctuary of their home and let the shallow world outside condemn them as it wished. But he would look at Sarah and see a new, quiet strength in her eyes. She was no longer the frightened, desperate woman from the train. She was the matriarch of their small family, and she would not be made to hide in shame. The ultimate test arrived in the form of a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was the invitation to the annual Children's Aid Society Charity Ball, the most important philanthropic event of the season. It was an event the Davenport family had chaired for generations. The invitation was addressed with deliberate precision to Julian. "She is forcing our hand," Julian said, tossing the invitation onto the library table. "If we do not go, it will be seen as a surrender. If we do, she will attempt to humiliate you publicly." "Then we must go," Sarah said simply. She walked over to him and placed a hand on his arm. "Penelope's power comes from the fear of what others think. We cannot let that fear dictate our lives, Julian. Not for us, and not for Amelia and Leo. We will go, not to seek their approval, but to state our truth. We are a family. That is all that matters." Looking at her unwavering courage, Julian felt his own resolve harden. She was right. He would not allow his sister's prejudice to cast a shadow over their happiness. The night of the ball, the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a glittering sea of New York's elite. The moment Julian and Sarah entered, a hush fell over the crowd, followed by a wave of frantic, excited whispers. They were the spectacle of the evening. They moved through the room, a united front, enduring the cold shoulders and the veiled, curious stares with a calm, dignified grace. Penelope, holding court near the orchestra, watched them, a smug, triumphant smile on her face. She chose her moment perfectly. As Julian was speaking with a city alderman, Penelope glided over to Sarah, who was standing alone for a moment. "Good evening, Mrs. Jenkins," Penelope said, her voice loud enough for those nearby to hear clearly. "How brave of you to come. It must be quite overwhelming for you. I do hope you are remembering which fork to use." She gave a small, cruel laugh. "One must be so careful not to embarrass Julian." Before Sarah could respond, Julian was at her side, his arm wrapping securely around her waist. His eyes were like chips of ice as he looked at his sister. "Penelope," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "I believe you have mistaken my fiancé for one of the staff. An easy mistake for you to make, I suppose, as you have never valued people for anything beyond their function." He then tapped his champagne glass with a spoon, the clear, ringing sound cutting through the ballroom's chatter. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to him. "Good evening, everyone," Julian said, his voice resonating with calm, absolute power. "Thank you for supporting this wonderful cause. I have been absent from this city's social life for some time, and I hear my absence has been the source of some creative speculation." A nervous laugh rippled through the crowd. "The stories you have heard are, for the most part, true," he continued, his honesty shocking the audience. "I was a man lost in his own grief. This house," he said, gesturing to Sarah, who stood proudly by his side, "was a cold and empty place, until this woman came into my life, and into the life of my daughter." He turned his gaze entirely on Sarah, his love for her a palpable, brilliant light in the center of the room. "The gossip pages would have you believe this is a story of a governess who trapped a lonely millionaire. They are, as usual, wrong. This is the story of a man who was saved from his own empty life by a woman of profound kindness, intelligence, and grace. She has mended my heart and turned my house into a home. She is the mother my daughter deserves and the partner my soul has been searching for." He raised his glass high. "I am here tonight not only to support the Children's Aid Society, but to formally and proudly introduce you to the future Mrs. Julian Davenport. My fiancée, my partner, and the best thing that has ever happened to me, Sarah Jenkins." He clinked his glass against hers. "To Sarah," he said, his voice full of a love that defied all social convention. The sheer, raw sincerity of his declaration was undeniable. It was not a defense, it was a proud proclamation. The crowd, which had come expecting a scandal, was instead witnessing a great love story. A wave of spontaneous, genuine applause erupted, sweeping through the ballroom. Penelope stood frozen, her face pale with fury, her social power utterly vanquished. Julian smiled down at Sarah, his eyes shining. "The whispers have stopped," he murmured. "Yes," she replied, her own heart soaring. "All I can hear is you." The aftermath of the charity ball was a seismic shift in the social landscape of New York. The story of Julian Davenport's passionate defense of his fiancée, the former governess, was on the front page of every society paper. But the tone was no longer one of scorn. It was one of breathless admiration. The city, so often cynical, had been captivated by a genuine love story. Penelope Davenport Astor's malicious campaign had backfired spectacularly, leaving her looking petty and cruel, while Julian and Sarah were hailed as the most romantic and intriguing couple of the season. The invitations that now arrived at the Fifth Avenue townhouse were addressed, with pointed respect, to Mr. Julian Davenport and Mrs. Sarah Jenkins. But Julian and Sarah had no interest in the fickle embrace of high society. They had faced their public trial and won. Now, they desired only the peace and privacy of the world they had built together. Their focus turned entirely to their wedding. They decided it would be a small private affair, a ceremony whose value would be measured not in the number of guests, but in the depth of its meaning. "I don't want a spectacle, Julian," Sarah had said one evening. "I just want our family." "And that," he had replied, taking her hand, "is all I have ever wanted." They chose to be married in the one place in the city that felt truly theirs. the small, once neglected rooftop garden that Sarah had so lovingly brought back to life. It was their private sanctuary, high above the noise of the city, a symbol of the new life she had cultivated in his world. The day of the wedding was bright and clear, one of the last perfect days of autumn. The small garden was decorated simply, with white ribbons woven through the trellises and pots of brilliant gold and crimson chrysanthemums. The guest list consisted of only 4 people: Amelia, Leo, a beaming Mrs. Albright, who had become one of Sarah's staunchest admirers, and a quiet elderly judge who was a trusted friend of Julian's. Sarah wore a simple but elegant dress of deep blue silk, a color that matched the twilight sky. She held no bouquet. Her hands were held securely by Leo on one side and Amelia on the other, as they walked her down the short makeshift aisle. Julian waited for her, his back to the magnificent city skyline. He wore a dark suit, his expression one of pure, unadulterated happiness. As Sarah approached with the 2 children who now formed the center of their world, his heart felt so full it might burst. The ceremony was short and deeply personal. Their vows were not grand pronouncements, but simple, heartfelt promises. "I came to you a man living in a house of rules, not a home of love," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion as he slid a simple, elegant gold band onto her finger. "You, Sarah, with your kindness and your courage, have taught me the difference. I promise to be your partner, your friend, and your loving husband for all of my days." Sarah's own voice trembled with joyful tears. "I came to you with nothing but a desperate hope for safety," she said, placing a matching ring on his finger. "You gave me not just a sanctuary, but a family, a purpose, and a love I never thought I deserved. I promise to cherish your heart, to honor your trust, and to love you and our children always." When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, the children cheered. Leo hugged his mother's legs, and Amelia, in a rare display of spontaneous emotion, hugged her father tightly. Julian leaned down and kissed his new wife, a kiss filled with the profound peace of a journey's end and the thrilling promise of a new one just beginning. Their reception was a simple dinner in the warm, inviting dining room of the townhouse, a room now filled with the easy laughter of a real family. They ate roast chicken and drank a single perfect bottle of champagne. The children, allowed to stay up late, told stories about their day, their cheerful voices a beautiful melody in the once silent house. Later that evening, after the children were tucked into bed, Julian and Sarah stood alone on the rooftop garden, looking out at the glittering tapestry of the city below. The cool night air was filled with the distant, romantic sounds of a saxophone playing in a club far below. "Mrs. Davenport," Julian said, pulling her close and wrapping his arms around her. "How does it feel?" Sarah leaned her head against his chest, a feeling of deep, unshakable contentment washing over her. She thought of the desperate, frightened woman on the train, a woman who thought her life was over. It seemed like another person, another lifetime. "It feels," she whispered, "like I am finally home." He held her tighter, his chin resting on the top of her head. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the lights of the city that had once seemed so terrifying and indifferent. They had faced its judgment and had built their own small, perfect world high above it. The lonely tycoon and the desperate mother were gone. In their place stood a husband and a wife, a family, their future as bright and as full of promise as the 1,000 glittering lights that stretched out before them. The first few years of their marriage were a period of profound and joyful peace. The Davenport townhouse, once a cold, sterile showcase of wealth, was now a true home, filled with the sounds of Amelia and Leo playing, the warmth of Sarah's presence, and the quiet contentment of a man who had finally found his harbor. Julian, who had once lived a life of rigid schedules and emotional solitude, discovered the simple, chaotic joys of family life. He learned to appreciate the happy mess of children's toys in the parlor and the sound of laughter echoing in the halls. Sarah blossomed in her new role. She was a loving mother to both children, a devoted wife, and the undisputed mistress of her home. But her heart, which had known such profound desperation, never forgot the woman she had been on the train, frightened, alone, and on the brink of destitution. She saw women like her on the streets of New York every day, widows of the war, single mothers abandoned by their families, women with children and no resources, no hope. One evening, as she and Julian sat in the library after the children were in bed, she turned to him with a thoughtful, determined expression. "Julian," she began, "do you remember the day we met? The absolute terror I felt not knowing where my son and I would sleep that night." "I will never forget it," he said softly, taking her hand. "There are thousands of women in this city who feel that same terror every single night," she continued, her voice filled with a passionate empathy. "They have no one to offer them a temporary position as a governess. They have no powerful man to step in. They have only the street." He listened, knowing she was building towards something important. "Your wealth, our wealth, it has given us this incredible sanctuary," she said, looking around the beautiful, safe room. "I believe we have a duty to share a piece of that sanctuary with others. I want to create a place, a home, a safe harbor for desperate mothers and their children, a place where they can find a warm bed, a hot meal, and most importantly, the tools and the time they need to get back on their feet." Julian looked at his wife, his heart swelling with pride. He saw her journey come full circle, from the desperate mother on the train to the compassionate visionary with a plan to save others in her same position. Her idea was not just charity, it was a mission born from her own lived experience. "It is a magnificent idea, Sarah," he said, his voice full of admiration, "and we will build it together." And so their new life's work began. It became their shared passion. Julian, with his formidable business skills, acquired a large, sturdy brownstone in a respectable neighborhood and oversaw its complete renovation. He established the legal and financial framework for the Davenport House for Mothers and Children, ensuring its long-term stability. Sarah was the soul of the project. She designed the interior to be warm, welcoming, and practical, not like a cold institution, but like a true home. She created programs for the women, offering not just shelter but childcare, job training, and classes in everything from basic literacy to household budgeting. She personally interviewed the first director, a kind but firm woman who shared her vision. They were a perfect team. He was the architect and the financier. She was the heart and the guiding spirit. Their love, which had healed their own small family, now expanded, becoming a force for good in the wider world. A year later, on a bright spring morning, they stood together on the steps of the newly opened Davenport house. The brass plaque on the door gleamed in the sun. They watched as the first residents arrived, a young widow clutching a baby, a mother with two small children who looked as lost and as frightened as Sarah had once felt. Sarah greeted each of them at the door, her smile warm and full of a genuine, empathetic understanding. "Welcome," she said to one young mother whose eyes were full of tears. "You are safe here." Julian stood back, watching his wife. He saw her quiet strength, her boundless compassion, and he knew that this was the true measure of their success. It was not the soaring height of his towers or the size of his fortune. It was this, the simple, profound act of offering a stranger a safe place to land. He walked to her side and slipped his arm around her waist. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a perfect echo of that first unconscious gesture on the train so long ago. But this time, there was no desperation, no uncertainty. There was only a shared sense of profound purpose and a love that had grown large enough to shelter many. Their legacy had begun. The years that followed were a testament to the quiet, powerful love that had been born on a long train journey. The Davenport House for Mothers and Children flourished, becoming a beacon of hope in the city, a model of compassionate, practical charity that inspired similar institutions across the country. It was the proudest achievement of their lives, a living legacy built on the foundations of their own unlikely meeting. Their own house on Fifth Avenue, once a cold and sterile monument, was now a true family home. It was a place filled with the warmth of Sarah's presence and the sound of laughter. Amelia and Leo grew up not as a daughter and a stepson, but as devoted siblings, their bond a reflection of the loving family their parents had forged. Amelia, once so solemn, blossomed into a confident, compassionate young woman with her mother's empathetic heart. Leo, a boy who had started his new life in fear, grew into a fine young man with his father's sharp mind and integrity, looking up to Julian as the only father he had ever truly known. Julian himself was a changed man. The ruthless, solitary Tycoon had been replaced by a man who understood the value of his family and his community. He was still a brilliant and powerful industrialist, but his decisions were now tempered with a wisdom and a humanity that only Sarah could have taught him. One crisp autumn afternoon, nearly 15 years after their wedding, Julian and Sarah sat together in a private compartment on the 20th Century Limited, the very train that had first brought them together. They were returning from a visit to see Leo at his university in Chicago. The gentle, rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track was no longer a sound of desperation, but a comforting, familiar lullaby. Sarah looked out the window at the passing landscape, a soft, contented smile on her face. "It's strange," she said, her voice a warm murmur. "I remember this journey so clearly. I remember looking out this same window and seeing nothing but a terrifying, empty future." Julian took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "And what do you see now?" She turned to look at him, her love for him shining in her eyes. "I see the man who gave me that future. I see the father of our children. I see my home." He smiled, a deep, easy smile that had long since replaced his former stern expression. "I remember that day as well," he said. "I remember being irritated that a stranger had fallen asleep on my shoulder. I was a man who valued his personal space, his order. Then I woke you and saw the sheer panic and desperation in your eyes." He shook his head, a look of wonder on his face. "In that one moment I realized my entire life of order and control was utterly meaningless compared to one single human soul in need. You were the most important business transaction I ever made, Sarah Davenport, the one where I traded my fortune for my soul." They sat in a comfortable silence, their hands intertwined, watching the world speed by. Their love story had not been a whirlwind romance of passionate, youthful declarations. It had been a slow, quiet burn, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the gentle, steady work of healing each other's lonely hearts. It was a love story for the ages. Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, a perfect, conscious echo of the unconscious act that had started it all. This time, there was no shame, no fear. There was only the profound, unshakable comfort of being exactly where she belonged. "We're almost there," he whispered, his arm wrapping around her. "Yes," she replied, a happy, peaceful sigh escaping her lips. "We're almost home." Life's most profound journeys are often set in motion by a moment of complete vulnerability. Do not be afraid of the moments when you must lean on a stranger, for it is in these acts of trust that the most unexpected connections are born. A true family is not forged by blood alone, but by the shared choice to protect, support, and love one another through any storm. The greatest legacy we can build is not one of wealth or power, but one of kindness. A single, compassionate act can ripple outwards, changing not just one life, but the world.